Lorenzo Warby, welcome back to Thinking Class for the third time, I believe.
Yes, it is. My pleasure.
Well, I'm sure it's not going to cap out at a trilogy. You write too many interesting pieces for that. I want to dive straight into some of your most recent pieces. And one of them has been on capitalism. And you make the argument that it is, to put it lightly, a very unhelpful and imprecise term. So, Lorenzo, why is capitalism an analytically dreadful term?
Okay, so the first thing to remember is it was originally popularized by Marx, and he was not a fan. And you should always be careful about terms which are coined by people who dislike the thing they're describing. It's not a good start. The next problem is that it's not a good description of how mercantile society really works. Because if you look at what commerce is, right, which is the buying and the selling, okay, it doesn't rely on just capital, right? You've got to use land, you've got to use labor, you've got to use capital, you've got to put them together. And there's a whole process of risk management, factor management, discovery processes, which economists call entrepreneurialism. That's all got to be done. Capital is just part of the story. And often the person doing the commerce, A, is not using their own capital, or if they are, it's not the only capital they're using. And capital isn't the central thing. It's a necessary thing, absolutely, particularly as you've got to have enough means of payment to cover the risks, right? And if you choose wrongly and you don't have enough coverage, well, you go out of business. But it's that coordination of things that makes commerce work. It's not just being a capitalist. And as I'm, spent the last 20 years in small business, I'm very aware that, what makes the business run is not capital. It's the coordination of people, of marketing, of service providing. And it's just a really bad way to think about commerce and business, to think it's about capital. Also, Marx has a very odd way of defining capital, but we'll leave that aside. And I sort of get really uncomfortable when people take up that term. I mean, economists have accepted it, and I don't really think they should, because I think it is very misleading about how commerce and business actually operates. So that's what
would the alternative be? Let's say there was an agreement amongst various nodes of economic boffins, economists, I think we call them, that decided capitalism, we're getting rid of the term. What would an alternative world look like that would be more precise?
Okay, I would prefer people to talk about commerce and mercantile society or commercial society. Because the other problem with capitalism is that Marx had this idea that it was this enormous system, right? And that ends up happening is people start conflating what the state does and what commercial operators do as some sort of unified thing, and it gets very unclear who's actually responsible for what. And that then leads to very poor analysis of a whole lot of things, like, for example, empires, which is seen as capitalist, which is not what they are at all, really. And so that's the problem. What you need is a term that's more precise, which invokes what's actually going on. So commerce is the buying and the selling, right? It's the organizing, the buying and the selling. Now, if you're in commercial production, you're also producing goods and services, which you're organizing the buying and services of. It's not the same as trade, right? So rulers engaged in trade, but they weren't doing commerce in that sense. So trade and commerce aren't exactly the same thing. Commerce is the process of the buying and the selling and the organizing to do that. It's not simple exchange, which, foragers traded stuff, but they weren't engaged in commerce in any complex sense. So yes, and so we should really talk about commerce, and we should talk about mercantile society or commercial society, and we should see the operation of the state as something that is a separate thing from what commerce does. Obviously, it sets up the institutional framework with which commerce operates, but commerce has a very complicated relationship with the state, including, of course, black markets, grey markets, formal commerce, informal commerce, So that's why I should say we should talk about commerce and we should talk about mercantile society or commercial society.
That would seem more fitting with the historical record, and this is, and you alluded to it, this is the issue with accepting the social history as Marx presented it.
Yeah.
I spoke recently with the great British anthropologist Alan McFarlane, who is Professor Emeritus at Cambridge, and his whole work. Oh, you met him?
No, I've read his book. It's very good.
Oh, you read it? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it is very good. So I've ended up down a rabbit hole of Alan McFarlane's work, and indeed he's coming back on so we can delve into it some more. But his whole shtick really was, as someone who was a trained historian and then became a trained anthropologist, he realized from reading the records that this social history that, and we're talking about England in particular here, which I think we can argue exported much of what we see in the modern world to the globe. And so it's important that we focus in on England. It was never a peasant society. So Marx was from Germany. It was very common for Europeans to live in peasant societies, which is to effectively be landless labourers and indentured to some kind of feudal prince or lord. Whereas in the English records, you can actually find that people of every class were trading land and property at least as far back as 1,000 years, but perhaps beyond that. People believe it actually goes right into Anglo-Saxon times.
Yes.
And so we had wage laborers then. That effectively what we're saying is the capitalist society that Marx said was created outside of the industrial, or within the Industrial Revolution, is false. It was already in England for many centuries before, and the Industrial Revolution was only possible because the people itself were capitalist by their nature. Is basically every innovation, whether it's technological or political, is downstream of a culture, an emergent culture that has already taken place. And so the notion of capitalism, as you've talked about it today, which can often be tainted with this idea of oppressor, oppressed, not to say there weren't some spurious business practices in the rise of the Industrial Revolution in the north of England. We know there were, but that it has been tainted with that brush is based on a false social history or a misreading of it in the place where it's most important.
Yes, absolutely. What England had right back was commercial society. Commerce was pervasive. And to say that those yeomen, for example, were capitalists is silly. But to say they were living in a commercial society is perfectly accurate. That was what exactly was going on. And actually that business about England not really a conventional peasant society, and that's not only about serfdom, that's also about how the households worked, for example.
Yes.
Very differently in the, right. To give you an indication of that, okay, so in the Second World War, what the British called an infantry division, the Germans called a motorized division, because all the British divisions were mechanized and motorized. But even in the Second World War, most of the German divisions were not. Most of their infantry divisions were still using horse-drawn transport. And that's the difference between a highly commercialized society whose farming had been commercialized for a long time and was a highly mechanized society. So if you were a British farm labourer, you knew your way around machinery because there was machinery where you worked. If you were a German peasant, there's a good chance you'd never had much to do with machinery at all. And that goes back to where industrialization happened first. But one of the reasons why industrializations happened first there is it was such a commercial society. When you look at why industrialization took off in England first, one of the things it becomes quite clear is you had all these jobbing artisans who are trying to solve commercial problems, right? James Watt is not some gentleman scholar doing this as an idle exercise. He has a practical commercial problem in front of him, which he wants to solve, and he expects to make money from, right? And it's just that's pervasive throughout the Industrial Revolution. So yes, and that's another way this terminology of capitalism and capitalist really gets in the way, right? So it's commerce, it's mercantile society, it's commercial society, it's the buying and the selling and the organising of the buying and selling. So, for example, there's two people who are really useful to read on this. One is Meg Cohn, who's a American economist at Dartmouth University, and he writes very interestingly. I mean, in fact, it's because I wrote a post that he commented on, we got in touch. I got to read his writings and I got to discuss things with him by email. And he's, I don't always entirely agree, but we mostly agree. And I found his stuff very enlightening and very informative, and it changed the way I looked at some of this stuff. And the other person who's a very interesting person to read is Peter Stringham, who I think is mainly a lawyer, but he's written a really interesting book on private governance, most of which is just straight history. The chapter where he gets more into theory and what you should do, that's the chapter I don't really agree with, but the rest is great. And one of the things he brings up is, again, and Cohen's on this point too, a lot of what evolved was people solving practical problems. Right? Stock markets didn't start because some ruler decided stock markets would be a great idea. Stock markets started often, sort of in the grey area of the law, because various people engaged in commerce could see a use for doing this and wanted to exchange stocks, basically, and financial instruments and raise capital, right? And so this is why stock markets are still run by private corporations. There's the Australian Stock Exchange is a private corporation that runs the Australian stock market, for example, and so forth and so forth. They grew up as a response to problems. Now, of course, you had an institutional framework where these things could grow up as responses to problems, and that makes a big difference. But that's not capitalism. That's commerce interacting with certain structures of culture and institutions and certain structures of the state. So,
question that's just dropped into the top of my brain there is, how significant do we think the framing of capitalism or having been, I suppose, formed by Marx's take on it, has been for what we now see as commercial society? So where I'm going with this is, we've talked about how pre-industrial revolution in England, we had a highly commercial society. We had lots of tinkerers and people trying to figure out a problem to be able to help them and their own individual endeavors. They would occasionally share what's going on within societies that they'd set up. It was civil society. It was an emergent property. It wasn't a top-down thing.
No.
Yet, what I notice is capitalism now is so heavily infused with state activity, insofar as it is directed, whether it's by regulators, whether it's by supranational bodies. And I can't help but think, if I think about the likes of Marx and Engels, and then a lot of their followers since, is that most of the time it serves to be able to view capitalism in their way, because it's about trying to, that false social history, this one of let's return it back to collective ownership. Well, in England, we can see that just never existed. And so, and even if the collective ownership existed that they're supposing is about at a family level or a community level, is what they're proposing is that it ends up being held at the state level. And so then you end up with states directing things and then all of the various side actors. So I guess the question is if there was a change in the understanding of capitalism, which, not utopian enough to think there will be, do you think that would change our approach to this heavily regulated top-down signaling world that we live in?
Yes, absolutely. People are used to thinking it as a system, as a unified system. And because if it's a unified system, the system can be managed and run and organized, right? There's a reason why Adam Smith was not very keen on the man of system, right? He thought that was a mistaken way of thinking about social and human action. And if you see it as commercial society, right, that's people acting in certain ways, but it's not a unified system in the same sense, right? And it's also clearly not intimately interactive with the state. The state may help it, the state may hinder it. The state may be helping, the state may be getting in the way. And when you look at commerce around the world, the relationship between commerce and the state is very, very complex. I mean, there's a lot of societies where there's a lot of state commercial action which tries to avoid the state as much as possible. I mean, it tries to hide itself from the state. And that's usually a sign that you've got a pretty dysfunctional state. I mean, Latin America and Africa, there's a lot of that. And the more dysfunctional bits of Asia, there's lots of that. But I'll give you a really practical modern example of where it's a system thinking goes wrong. And that is the commercial development of China, right? So people say Deng Xiaoping did this thing. That's not what happened. What happened is in the Cultural Revolution, there was such a churn and such disorganization of the Communist Party, because remember, Mao is using various levers to churn over the Communist Party to break up people who are opposing his will in the system, right? So he uses the Red Guard against the Communist Party, then he uses the military against the Communist Party. And the Communist Party lost a lot of its penetration into the countryside because of this churn and disorganization and so forth. So villagers started doing their own thing. And it's clear when you start looking at the records that even at the height of the Cultural Revolution, there was still a lot of commerce going on. How can we tell? All the people being charged with engaging in commerce, right? They were constantly charging people for engaging in commerce. So what that tells us is there was a lot of commerce going on, right? And what happened is villagers started just saying, we hate collectivization, we're all agreeing to redivide the land and we'll have our own farms and we'll just quietly get together and pay the state, right? And after a while, and you start getting this commerce bubbling up, and then local officials began to sort of let it run. And basically what happened is Deng Xiaoping was smart enough to go, oh, this seems to be working. Let's just see how this runs, right? And part of what was going on is we think of Deng as the sort of dominant leader of China. He was the most important figure, but he wasn't as dominant as people thought he was, outsiders thought he was. And in fact, the CCP itself was divided. And because it was divided, this also gave more capacity for people at the lower level to do their own thing. And the guy who, I think his name was Chen Yun, who was Deng's rival, was more of an old-style Marxist. But what they had in common was a large dose of Chinese pragmatism, right? And they were both pragmatic at the basic operational level, even though they were both Marxist, Leninist, Maoists, right? And these factors all came together. And over time, what evolved was an interaction between party, state, and local action that led this commerce to start bubbling up and bubbling up and bubbling up. And after a while, particularly after he went to Japan and saw how productive East Asians could be if you stopped getting in their way, and then American back, right? They went with it. Now, there was all sorts of ups and downs, but that's how you get a commercial turn in a society that's theoretically Marxist-Leninist and which doesn't actually legalize commerce at any sort of serious level in 2004, right? It's been running seriously since 1978. Okay, now this also, I have to go, gets in the way of all those things about, well, you've got to have secure property rights. Yeah, yes and no. They obviously found a very Chinese way to have functional property rights, even though they weren't actually legal. And this is that complicated relationship between commerce and the state. Now, if you think of it as capitalism and as what Deng Xiaoping did, you're actually getting the story really, really fundamentally wrong. And so, yes, and another way it misleads this idea of capitalism. It's the ownership of capital is crucial. It's all top down. Is, as I alluded to earlier, people get the way the Western empires worked and how you understand the Western empires work, basically because they trying to put it into a capitalist mode. And you think to yourself, well, that's not right, because have always been, as soon as you have states, you have empires. And these you wouldn't call, Sargon of Akkad's empire capitalist, but it's clearly an empire, right? And so on and so on and so forth. So, yes, the terminology gets in the way. It forces people to think about it as a unified system when it's not. It way overemphasizes the importance of capital. It way underemphasizes risk management, discovery, coordination. It way underestimates the way it is a process in a society of networks. And commerce is just something that people keep doing, right? We used to wonder how the Soviet Union could make itself functional. I mean, it didn't, of course, but to the extent that it did, a lot of that was black markets. So it was hidden commerce, and we say, oh, that's all criminal. Yeah, it actually allowed the system to get around some of its own stupidities, because people would trade illegally, but they would trade in a way that make things function, where if they were just doing the proper Gosplan thing, well, more or less nothing would work. At least not for very long. So yes, unless, I'll rephrase that slightly differently. If you're Stalin and you're willing to shoot lots of people and everyone's terrified and you've got competing lines of information, you can sort of kind of make it work. But the minute it sort of starts regularizing and all the bureaucratic problems start coming about because you have regularized it, well, you get what you get. You get the slow, steady stagnation. But yes, so commerce is a thing people do. And if you lead them, they'll just do it.
When you mentioned that when people assert that if we just had individual property rights, then everything would be fixed all over the world, that is where I do see, as someone who is in Great Britain, the Anglo-centric worldview come out, which our diaspora has as well in America, Oz, New Zealand, exactly, Canada, in that ultimately we've all come out of an island which the law reflects the culture. So that was something that emerged. The law then had to respond to the cultural mores of the people and the demands initially of the elites, but also of just the way people did things. And that was how society ran. It's how we interact with one another even today, and why when we feel cheated or when we see clannish practices taking place in the country, we all cry foul, because it's not something we've ever done. Yep. But because it's worked here and it's worked in the Anglosphere, and we think, well, we stumbled across something. I mean, in many respects, you could say, particularly on the legal system, we stumbled across something truly unique. However, and I don't want to get too culturally relativist on things, but in reality, is certain practices do just work better in certain places because the people are different. They've got different ways of interacting, different cultural mores, and so you can't just go foisting that system on them and expect it to work. And whilst we're on culture, you've written a really interesting article about popular theories of economic growth. Right. And it's really, really common to find, and pretty much every election cycle, talk of politicians saying, we are going to supercharge growth. We've got this plan, and growth is coming back to this country. We see it in the United Kingdom all the time. You've referred to this notion as crank the handle theories of economic growth. What are they, and why don't they work in your estimation? Okay,
yes. I've also called it Legoland theory of economic growth, just assemble the blocks. Right. Okay, so there's a thing called a Cobb-Douglas function, which basically says you put labour and capital together and crank the handle and production comes out, right? Robert Solow, who died not long ago, had this model of economic growth, which is basically the Cobb-Douglas function. You add some parameters in, and which identifies, for example, either labour productivity or multi-factor productivity, depending how you do it, and that will tell you the path of economic growth, right? So once you've identified the level of labour, the level of capital, you've identified the relevant parameters, as long as you get the right rate of productivity growth, away you go, right? Now, the most obvious problem with that model is it predicts that economies will converge. And of course they don't, right? There was a problem with a mathematically expressed model that has a prediction that doesn't come true. It should make you go back and go, something's wrong here.
And when you say converge, this is the expectation that you can equalize the economic outcomes of different countries and regions if you just have the appropriate plan and investment.
Yes, right. So if you have enough capital, enough labour, and you get the productivity growth right, because it's easier to copy inventions already made than be at the cutting edge of economic growth, where you've got to sort of invent new things all the time. Everyone will just look what the rich people are doing and they will copy the rich people, and everyone will converge as long as they've got enough capital, right? That's the prediction. Obviously, it hasn't come true, right? And I never liked it. I never liked it because it seemed to me that it was obvious that different countries had different capacities to put labour and capital together. We're extracting away from land. Just let's not worry about that for the moment. And even groups within countries had different capacities to put labour and capital together and to generate capital, for that matter. And so it seemed to me was just not expressing what went actually on, what happened. And then you get things like the gentleman who just got the Nobel Memorial for economics, their point about the institutions really matter. And you look at the solo model, or even the amended one, which adds in human capital, and you think, yeah, where are institutions in that equation? And the answer is nowhere, really. And now we've got the long-term economic growth literature, where basically what's happened, since we've got this enormous computing power, what various scholars have done is they've just assembled these enormous data sets and then just said, what are the patterns we can find in these data sets, right? What's there? And what they are coming up with is culture matters, to back to your previous point. And for example, if you go look at where people are in 1500, and they're relatively developed for 1500, and you follow the people, not the territory, you follow the people, then they're the people who are rich now. Right? So who was rich in 1500? Europe, particularly Northwestern Europe, East Asia, particularly China and Japan. You follow the Europeans, you follow the East Asians. Where they are now is where people are rich, like, for example, Australia or New Zealand or Canada or so forth, right? Singapore, right? Which was nothing, and now is the richest city in the world, or close to the richest city in the world. So, I mean, of course, culture and institutions can't entirely be separated. And there's also all the organizational work, which says, yeah, we tried running an organization we structured for England in this country, and their culture's different, and the organization doesn't work the same, right? Transnational corporations are wrestling with this all the time. And in fact, there's a military analyst called Kenneth Pollock who wrote his PhD thesis on why Arabs lose conventional wars. And he's since updated that into 2 books since, the most recent, which is Armies of Sand. And his thesis was basically their culture leads them to lose conventional wars. Now, insurgencies are different, right? They're a different matter. But when it comes to why they're armies, which look like everyone else's armies. They've got companies, they've got battalions, they've got captains and majors and colonels, and they've got lines of command. Structurally, they look like everyone else's armies. They do badly in conventional warfare because of the way Arab culture works. Now, Arabs can do insurgency warfare. They can definitely do that. But their armies don't work, right? One interesting result of this is when you look at Israel, you think, it's not that the IDF is all that special. It's just a Western army that gets lots of practice, essentially. Because whenever Western armies fight conventional wars against Arab armies, they beat the tar out of them. And this goes back to culture matters. And where is that in, Solo Swan growth model or the updated, I can't remember the three people involved, but one's Manacrew and there's two others, I can't remember who they are, model which they've added in human capital, right? It doesn't grasp any of that. Yet clearly this is really, really crucial. And my response is, look, you've got to go back to the beginnings of human economic activity, by which I mean right back to the beginning, so when we were foragers. And when you look at how foragers operate, there's three types of capital which are important. One is human capital, one is physical capital, one is social capital, right? So physical capital for them is tools. The human capital matters because if you can't make the tools and if you can't use the tools effectively, it doesn't matter if you have tools or not. Either the tools won't exist or you won't be able to use them. So you have to have the human capital, you have to have the physical capital, but the other thing they do is social capital. Social capital connections are really, really, really important for foragers. So you can have modern foragers who walk everywhere, right? People at the Hasda and so forth in Africa who can have connections that extend up to 200 kilometres away, right? And they're mechanisms for information, for buffering yourself against bad times, for arranging marriages. And the one thing every single marriage system in the planet has in common, in fact, the only thing every single marriage system in the planet has in common is they create in-laws. They create relations by marriage. And that's, in these societies, a really, really, really crucial aspect of marriage. And in fact, it's why courtship, it's a big reason why courtship marriage is not a majority form of marriage in human societies. Because that role of connecting is really, really important. Okay, and we're normative, right? We're a normative species. So you're looking at human capital, social capital, yes, physical capital matters, yeah, they're the tools. And you've got to look at the normative landscape. And it turns out you've got to look at the cultural landscape and you've got to look at the institutional landscape, right? This is all going to matter. So if you take, why has foreign aid failed so much? You take capital, you put it into a local area where they don't have the skill base, they don't have the connections you expect, they don't have the institutions that you expect, they're not going to use it in the way you expect. The state is probably going to be a problem, not a benefit, right? Of course, you end up, your foreign aid system not working because it's all based on this idea that, if you just assemble the labor and you assemble the capital and you get the human capital job, you just crank down and it works. That's not how human societies work. That's not how human economic growth happens. Go back to commerce. What's commerce about? Discovery, coordination, risk management, connections, right? You've got to look at all those things. And of course, if you look at it like that, you're not going to expect societies to converge because there's a whole lot of things that are going to have to happen, which are much more than take the labor and take the land and take the capital and put them together and away you go, right? So, and this is where you become skeptical of the sort of just add X command things about economic growth. For example, if you have a really, 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 really regulated land use system, then your land's not going to be moving towards most productive use, is it? If you have a system where you have a lot of interference in activities, like the tech entrepreneur Mark Andreessen has a great example. Why does China dominate the commercial drone market? because the US FAA decided that you couldn't make a commercial drone in the United States that operated out of line of sight of the operator. Because, something bad might happen. All right. Don't think they worry about that in China. I think they just make drones.
You've talked a lot about the reward mechanisms for doing things which are part of social capital, and you drew out in your article two kinds of social capital, or two ways in which social capital can be afforded. One through prestige, and that's the reward of doing the difficult things, for being competent, and it's what you refer to as producing positive externalities. And then you've got that is afforded by status, which is you uphold the norms of the group. And I think we'll come on to that shortly, because I'd like to talk about the rise of activist networks. But the prestige angle, social capital being afforded for prestige, I think you could argue, and it links back to that final point you made about the US FAA, that we have created a world post-industrial revolution where we no longer reward people for competence, for doing the risky, clever, hard, entertaining things, to quote your article. And Elon Musk has made this point, which is people need to build things. And people who've defended him have said, look, if you don't want him dominating, well, then go and build some stuff, because that's what he's doing. The reason why he's so successful is because he's had all of these ideas and he's taken the risks. He's come up with some clever ideas. It's hard, but he's seen it through, and that's the way he's built. But the rest of us, we're just thinking about regulating. We're just thinking about more bureaucracy. And because we have set up a whole bunch of various institutions which are geared towards more bureaucracy around the things that they care about, that's a way that you can expand your own influence and social capital without actually doing the hard things. But everyone in the group's pointing to each other saying, well done, you're doing a great job. This is exactly what we need. And you can see that in the European Union. Whilst you got the US and China fighting it out to develop AI, EU is not doing that. They're just regulating it. And they take pictures of their bureaucrats looking really happy that, look, we've just created this new 8,000-page regulation as to what you can and can't do, and everyone flanking them is developing it themselves. So let's talk a little bit about how our economic system, our cultural life has come to be dominated by activists. You wrote an article about activist network states. Yep. What are they, and why are we living in one?
Oh, well, excellent. Yes. Okay. So a seminal cultural moment of recent times is now over 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago now, November 2014, a rocket scientist is the lead person in a very, 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 very clever thing, which is they land a probe on a comet, which is really, really hard, and we had never done it before. So this is the classic clever thing that the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution was built on. You've done this really clever thing. You get prestige for doing this really clever thing. What happens? He happened to be wearing a Hawaiian shirt with semi-naked women on it, which turns out was actually a gift from a female friend. He got publicly monstered and humiliated for his shirt. Now, that's the difference between prestige, the clever thing of landing on a comet, which is really hard, and we don't like your shirt because it's got semi-naked women on it, so we are going to massively stigmatize you. And stigma is the negative aspect of propriety, right? And so that's the other, well, there's actually three status systems. The two we're talking about here are prestige and propriety. And stigma is the negative thing. Now, all societies have stigma because they want to stop you doing stuff that hurts other people, right? It's all the negative externalities. But like everything human, it can be misused. And what you're seeing is that use of stigmatization to punish people on, an ever widening bunch of new sins. Misgendering, that's a new sin. Nobody knew what misgendering was in 2014, or if they did, they're a tiny minority somewhere, right? Incredible sensitivity about language, new sins. And stigmatization is being used to punish people for transgressing against these new sins, right? So, and you've got to say people of colour, you can't say coloured people, for example. Now, that's a status game. That's a status leverage game. It is power through controlling what is legitimate discourse, through controlling the legitimacy of discourse. Okay. And if you can, and it's power also through narrative control. Like you control the narrative. And if you want to see that playing out, Elon Musk saying, all these girls got raped, perhaps you should worry about that, on one hand, and all the people complaining that Elon Musk is complaining. Right. So there's the people who say actually industrial level rape over decades is a horrifying crime. How did this happen? Why aren't you talking about it? And on the other hand, you say the people who really, really resent Elon Musk are bringing it up because they want to get narrative control, or they want to get narrative control back. And it turns out if you're Elon Musk and you've bought Twitter and turned it to X, you can insert, because you've got 200 million followers, you can insert yourself into the news cycle and you can get the news cycle. Right. Okay. So that is stigmatization used successfully in the case of Shirtgate, and as so far unsuccessfully against Elon Musk as a form of activism and of status control and status leverage and narrative control. Okay, so activism is an attempt to change society in some way, and a classic way of doing activism is to stigmatize previously acceptable behavior. And sometimes, frankly, that's fair enough, right? When we got men and women working together in offices and professional establishments way more than they used to, actually we did need to stigmatize men who thought they could pinch bottoms, right? We did need to stigmatize men who thought they could leer at their female workplaces. We did have to say, no, actually you do have to keep your dick in your pants, right? That sort of stigmatization was absolutely fair enough. It had to be something to happen, and some of it took court cases and people went to jail, right? That's a stigmatization. We've moved to this new situation. We've got men and women working together at a level we haven't had before, and men have to just stop doing certain things, right? So that's reasonable stigmatization. Now, a lot of what's happened since is they've taken this weapon that has some value and has existed and evolved because it has value, and then turned it into a weapon of social leverage and social activism. And because we're very prosperous societies, we've developed a whole set of stuff that's based on that sort of activism. One is all the non-profits, right? All the advocacy groups. And part of what happened there is, civil rights got achieved for African Americans in the United States. Civil rights got achieved for women and equality before law. Civil rights got achieved for gay and lesbian people and equality before law, and they can get married, they can adopt, right? Okay, but these organisations have millions and millions and millions of dollars flowing through them and suddenly nothing to do. Right? What do? Well, they pivot to something else, and what they pivoted to was trans. And what the gay and lesbian organisations pivoted to was trans. And part of the problem there is there were two huge problems. Everyone thought, well, this is just like the gay issue, when it's really, really, really not. And they use the gay model when it's a really, really different case. And so you've got this massive advocacy economy, which needs to keep the donations flowing, has all this structure, and is based on activism. And the natural lever they use is stigmatization. And of course, social media makes this potentially much more effective. Right? So you got a situation recently where I think it's the CEO of the Therapeutic Association in the UK had to publicly abase himself because it was found that he was following Tommy Robinson on Twitter, on X, right? That's a utterly spurious sin used in stigmatization. So you have this network where stigmatization is an easy mechanism, and social media really makes you able to scale up that mechanism. And one of the problems with social media is you're only dealing with slivers of people, right? If you're actually physically with somebody, you see the full person. This is a full person. You get the whole interactions. And it's also something we've evolved for to deal with for, hundreds of thousands of years. Right. Online, you're just dealing with a sliver of a person. It's not the same feedback at all. So a lot of the ameliorating factors and pacifying, humanizing factors go away. And it, upgrades, scales up stigmatism, and that's an easy mechanism for activists. But there's also other things going wrong too. What we've done is we've moved from a situation where bureaucrats just made things work to where they have these moral projects. You don't give bureaucrats moral projects for several reasons, one of which it gives them airs and pretensions way beyond their capacities. It inflates their authority, and it undermines accountability. Because if they say, we're doing X to do this good thing, and you say, well, I think you shouldn't be doing X, their response is, you don't want us to do this good thing. What I call the actor's fallacy. So it undermines accountability, it inflates their authority, and it also, how do you measure this moral project? When do you know it's worked? And again, you can't tell it's worked because there is no good measure. Okay. And so people like Christopher Caldwell and Richard Hanier, who point out that anti-discrimination and civil rights legislation has proved to be a real problem because it's created this whole legal bureaucratic structure, which is based on the presumption that if you don't have this legal bureaucratic structure, everybody's hovering on the end of wrong action and wrong think. And you've undermined freedom of association. You've engaged in all this forced association. And if you look back at human societies, who you choose or choose not to associate is actually an important mechanism. And of course, people can exclude people quite illegitimately. That's absolutely true, particularly in small communities. But systematic forced association is turning out to be a problem too, because people can't step back from what they regard as bad behaviour. And you've created this, embedded network of people on the presumption that if they weren't there, everyone would become, raging homophobes and raging racists and raging whatevers. Right. The evidence is that's just rubbish. Right. The crucial thing was, in fact, the change in the stigmatization. Once you stop stigmatizing people because they were black or stigmatizing people who were gay, you eliminated that stigmatization. That did the overwhelming majority of the work. And this complicated, expensive structure is actually doing way more harm than good because it's interfering in ways. It leads directly to all the DEI nonsense, for example. So it gets in the way of people just functioning and getting along. And so you're creating these activist structures. And the incentive is constantly to target the bureaucracies, because then you don't have to go through the boring stuff of convincing voters and arguing your case and so forth. You go via the bureaucracy. It's what the writer Wesley Yang calls the non-electoral politics of institutional control. That's not quite the right phrase, but there's a phrase like that. And that's a problem. And one of the things you get, for example, is the UN, which is completely unaccountable. Like, you get people laundering ideas through the UN, which are typical terrible ideas. They go to the UN, they get written up by the UN, and then everyone says, well, we should do this because the international communities agree, right? You're doing end run around democratic accountability. That's one of the big problems of the EU. The EU is a little bit more accountable than the UN, well, quite a lot more accountable because the UN is completely unaccountable. But it's still, the accountability is still not very good. So you get in the EU, being used to launder these ideas and do end runs around democratic accountability, which goes back to your 5,000 word regulatory document, which has not been subject to anywhere near the examination that they should be subject to. And these regulatory claims are based on claims of we know that, which are almost invariably spurious. They don't know, right? But their status comes from being the superior deciders. And if you give them a moral project, that makes that much worse. The European project inflates the authority quite illegitimately of what the EU gets up to. So you've got these networks of, and academe, of course, generates all these ideas from people who also don't have to make things work. There's a constant problem with the ideas coming out of academe because it's been done by people who don't have to make things work, but can get this spurious prestige from this golden idea. And that's been just a perennial problem. It's been a problem for decades amongst education faculty, for example. Teachers have become full of really dumb ideas which don't work, which were not reality tested, but which inflated the egos of the academics, either on the basis of I've got this brilliant idea that no one else has thought of before, that's because it doesn't work, or we're going to change society in this dramatic and wonderful way, which sanctifies activism. So you've got this sanctification of activism, this generation of ideas, of morally inflating ideas. You've got these moral inflating of the authority of bureaucrats way beyond their levels of knowledge and competence. You've got this undermining and these end runs around democratic accountability. So we end up with a situation in Britain, for example, where Britain has a really stupid and disastrous migration policy that the electorate has never approved of, never agreed to, and the end runs around democratic accountability have just been endless. The British elite political class has just systematically lied. Because they just know, and it turns out they just didn't, that in fact the electorate was correct and the elite was wrong. Democratic accountability isn't perfect, but it turns out it's a lot better than the lack of it. And yes. And so
absolutely. I was going to say that your point about the immigration policy, which has been a disaster and never formally approved by anyone, and usually on the basis that in the end people become just like us, is totally refuted even if you look at the UK Home Office, which has all of these networks that you talk about. So typically set up with progressive ideals. You get multicultural networks so people can set up their own nodes to advance the interests, whether it's of their ethnic group, whether it's of their religion. And there's a 700-strong Muslim network within the Home Office that advocates for policy change to enable the achievement of Muslim needs. That clearly tells you that integration is not on the menu, because clearly that's counter to whatever came before the arrival of that network and indeed that group of people. And it's not just Muslims either. I mean, we see the Conservative Party aligning with the Hindu vote, which puts them at odds with Labour, who typically try to align with the Muslim vote. And this is just goes on and on. So it's not even just about advancing progressive ideals at this point. Is we've blinded ourselves to this so much that we don't even see when groups are trying to advance their own religious and ethnic glory, that any sense of institutional neutrality is absolutely pulled apart on this. And indeed, there's probably no such thing as a neutral institution, because you always have friend and enemy distinctions, and we might cloak it up in certain languages, but in reality, you can pretty much always find out which team someone's batting for in the end. And I suppose there are many people in the country who are saying, well, if we're seeing this, unless we get on top of it, we really could see some quite substantial rewiring of the British state away from its emergent constitutional settlement that has taken place over such a long time. I mean, you could argue that changed when Tony Blair walked into office and perhaps at various times in the 40s and 60s. But let's just go with, we've now got a bunch of different peoples with their own interests. They're now advancing them. And this then leads people to, and here comes a segue to talk about another one of your articles. It leads people to go, well, this could be the end. This could be the end of Britain as we know it. And it all came from the fall of the empire. We've just unraveled since that point. And that leads us on to a previous episode that I've had with authors of a book, Why Empires Fall, by Peter Heather and John Rapley. Peter Heather is a historian of antiquity, and John Rapley, a development economist. And they suppose or propose that the fall of an empire, and particularly the fall of Rome, could not just be understood because of a large influx of peoples from outside of Rome and from outside the empire, i.e. non-citizens or subjects. But they go on to advance that any coming apart of an empire, and then it blurs a bit, it gets into civilization and nation, is through a bureaucratic overreach in some respects, which I suppose we see and could agree with, but also because of financial indebtedness, having lived beyond their means, but then also through the trade with those on the periphery of the empire. We've raised their ability and they have now become rivals. And so they try to, I suppose, diminish the importance that was placed upon the Edward Gibbon fall of the Roman Empire model of barbarian invasion led to the fall, and said, actually, there's a whole bunch of other things over here that would have more likely caused it. So you have disputed, not all of it, but part of it. What's right in there? What's wrong in there?
Okay, yes. So the other, effectively essays of mine are all on my own Substack, which is Lorenzo from Oz. I did a review essay on Helen Dale's Substack of this book because I was interested in the book. I got it in Kindle and started reading it and realized I really seriously disagreed with aspects of it. Now, I should preface that by saying Peter Heather has written a good book on the fall of the Roman Empire. I thought Ward Perkins' book, which came out at almost the same time, was better, but it was a good book. He's written a very interesting book on the post-Roman barbarian civilizations and states, which I'm still in the process of reading. And one thing he is very good at is discussing the interaction between Rome and its periphery. Right, so you get the Roman Empire, it unifies the Mediterranean, literally all the Mediterranean coast, extends as far as Britain, Roman Britain, which is essentially modern England, and the Rhine Valley and the Danube. The Rhine and the Danube basically forms its border. And on the other side of the border, because you have this developed large state, you develop people who trade with the Romans, who in various ways copy the Romans, but also periodically raid the Romans because they're the rich people, right? They've got the stuff. And the Romans have this complicated business of frontier wars, river navies, punitive expedition, major wars, where they manage to varying degrees and mostly pretty successfully their interaction with these people, who nevertheless are developing as time goes on. And that was a very interesting and useful discussion. There are some aspects of it that I thought were much less useful. One is, one of the features of the Roman Empire is at the end of what's known as the crisis of the 3rd century, it becomes hugely more bureaucratic, particularly under the Emperor Diocletian, who stabilizes the empire after this period of flux and civil wars and short-run emperors, most of whom got murdered. He stabilizes the empire, and one of the ways he stabilizes the empire is by incredibly increasing the bureaucracy, because he shifts to an in-kind taxation system far more, which requires more bureaucrats than what they had earlier, where they had a lot of self-governing cities. It was a very commercial empire, and most of their income came from silver mines and customs duties. And it was an empire that didn't take very many people to run, really, because the cities were mainly self-governing. So, not including the imperial household, there were about 300 full-time civil servants running the empire. Because when you appointed a rich equites to one of their provinces or a rich senator to one of their provinces, they'd bring their own staff. And, it's a urbanized civilization. Yeah, most people live in the countryside, but the cities are really what matters for organization. They're self-governing, right? Away you go. You don't actually need much administrative structure. The British Raj in India, right, is not dissimilar. There weren't actually all that many civil servants running the British Raj. But he bureaucratizes, he massively increases the bureaucracy. And although Rapley and Heather admit that the empire was less economically integrated and that the cities were in retreat, and the self-government of the cities was being undermined by this imperial bureaucracy, which was imperial in all sorts of ways, apart from that, they don't really treat the bureaucracy as a major factor, which is, to my mind, complete nonsense, because when you go from a central bureaucracy of about 300 people to a bureaucracy of 30,000 or thereabouts, so it's grown by orders of magnitude, that's way more expensive. And we can tell from things like ice cores and lead in ice cores and so forth, that the economic activity of the empire had fallen. So you've got less economic activity, which is one reason why you're going for more in-kind taxation. You've got a lot more bureaucrats, which means that a lot of that revenue is eaten up by the process of administration, which means that the imperial state is just less effective. And one of the things you can see really clearly if you look at the history of the empire, the imperial state of the 4th and 5th centuries is considerably less capable than the imperial state of the 1st and 2nd centuries. And one of the big signs of that is the roads start deteriorating. Because the cities are shrinking, they're becoming dominated by bureaucracy, they don't have much, the trade has fallen, they don't have as much incentive to keep the roads going, you don't have the spare resources to do so anyway, and of course that hurts trade, which hurts integration in the economy of the empire. So this structure is crucially important into the way the empire became less effective. Right? Now, there is a sort of line of argument, the Roman Empire became totalitarian. I think that's a complete misuse of the terminology and you shouldn't go there. The bureaucracy just got a lot more expensive. And as a result, the state became a lot more less capable and became much more of a coordination problem, which is why the empire ends up splitting. Because to manage a bureaucracy of 300 people is one thing. To manage a bureaucracy of 30,000 people with the technology of the time is a completely different exercise. And we can tell it mattered because what does Diocletian do? He sets up the tetrarchy. I can't pronounce it. 4 people, basically. There's 2 Augusti and there's 2 Caesars, and the 4 of them run the empire between them. Right, what does that tell you? He's admitting that huge bureaucracy is a much bigger coordination problem. And so you get the empire divided, then comes back together and divides and comes back together and then divides again. Right after Theodosius the Great, it's always divided. Because it is less capable, it's much harder to manage. Yes, so that structure of a bureaucracy that's much more expensive and gets in the way of stuff is an important dynamic. And bureaucracies are just not machines. You just don't wind them up and they go. Bureaucracies have pathologies. And if you're not careful, the pathologies get worse over time, which fairly clearly did happen in the Roman Empire. And I can tell you, absolutely happens under every Chinese imperial dynasty. If you look at the big unifying dynasties, the bureaucracy is much worse at the end of the dynasty than it is at the beginning of the dynasty. because bureaucracies have pathologies. And if you're not careful, the normal thing to happen is for the pathologies of bureaucracy to get worse over time. So what happens with the empire is they became less and less able to manage this interaction. Trade levels have fallen because you've had two huge plagues, the Antonine plagues and the Cyprian plagues. Population has fallen. The silver mine production has collapsed. So you're having real problem with your monetary system. Now, in the book, they say, well, the demands of the new Sassanid empire, which replaced the Parthians, which was much more efficient and aggressive, which it was, increased the demand to spend money on the army, the Roman army, to guard this border against this much more aggressive state, which it is genuinely a problem. I mean, they lost an entire army and with the emperor captured by the Persians, right? It's only ever happened once where you got an emperor captured by your enemy. So they lost the entire army and the emperor at the Battle of Edessa because Sharp the Great was a very effective military figure. Okay. He used the captured emperor as a footstool. He used him to stand on him to get on his horse. Okay, and when he died, they skinned him and they hung up his skin as a souvenir in the palace. Right? Okay. Central Eurasian pastoralist dynasties, they're fun. Okay, right. History, it's full of great stuff. Yes, but when you look at the actual, because we've got all these Roman coins, we can measure how much silver's in them, right? When you look at the silver in the coin, it's quite clear that the silver content of the coins collapsed before the Sassanid dynasty took over. And that, I would argue, in fact, that was partly caused because if the silver production collapses because you're going deeper and deeper and you have these plagues and your slave miners all die because they're trapped together in horrible conditions and the mines flood, which they did, and you can't get at the silver anymore, and you've got to debase your coinage. But that means, of course, that you were exporting silver as a trade system. Your silver went into the Indian trade system. We know because there's lots of Roman coins been dug up in India. Right, this trade flow stops, or doesn't completely, but craters really badly. Trade is a crucial revenue base. So you get all these Indian Ocean states that either go into retreat or collapse. Meanwhile, the Han dynasty is collapsing at the same time. And you've got this other trade system, which is you can't grow horses in China because the soil's short of selenium. So the basic thing is that the Chinese would export silk and they'd buy horses. And then that silk would then be traded, some of that silk would be traded further through the Parthians and the Kushans into the Roman Empire, right? So you've got these two trade systems collapsing at the same time. And what happens, The Kushan Empire falls over, the Han dynasty falls over, the Parthian Arasakid dynasty gets overthrown by the Persian Sassanid dynasty, right? And Rome falls into the crisis of the 3rd century. Rome survives because it's still got the Mediterranean Sea, and that's a trade base they can keep going with, right? But so that's all going on, and that then the knock-on effect is you can't run this commercialized trade system like you used to, so you have in-kind taxation, so you have a much bigger bureaucracy, so you're subject to the pathologies of bureaucracy, so your state becomes less capable. And this is a very different pattern than when their suggestion. Right. And the reason why the people on the periphery get more aggressive is they've learned all these things from the Romans, and the Romans are less of a trade power than they used to be. So if you can't get their stuff by trading them, you get their stuff by raiding them. And so raiding countries shoots up and aggression shoots up, and these German states are now bigger and better organized than they used to be. And they're more of a threat. So you get the Battle of Adrianople, for example, where the Eastern Roman field army and the Eastern Emperor get killed by the Goths. Now, there's a lot of nonsense talked about this battle. People say stupid things like it's the triumph of cavalry, right? the Romans had lost Crassus's army in 54 BC or whenever it was to a overwhelmingly Parthian cavalry army. They'd lost Valerian's army at Edessa to an overwhelmingly cavalry Persian army. If you look at the Battle of Adrianople, it's just a repeat of Cannae, where Hannibal destroyed an entire consular army and killed 2 consuls, right? It's basically the same. You pin the Roman infantry, you use your cavalry to strip their cavalry, you've pinned the infantry, your cavalry comes back, hits them in the rear, it's a horrible massacre. The only difference with Adrianople is they used a wagon lager instead of a clever infantry formation, right? It's the same deal. It's Cannae repeated. What the significant thing about this battle was is that the Germanic peoples can now organize effective armies and battles at the same scale the Romans can, and they can win. Now, here's the problem. It's a lot cheaper to put a Germanic warrior in the field than it is to put a Roman soldier in the field, because you've got this great big bureaucratic tail. And if, operationally you've lost your advantage, but your soldiers are much more expensive, I can tell you what's going to happen over time. Over time, you're going to lose. You can get away with having expensive soldiers only if you're operationally much more effective. All right? So there is a story about Rome and the periphery here, but it is also a story about decay within the Roman Empire, the problems of bureaucracy, the problems of falling economic activity, and just becoming expensive, right? The Romans decided to use cavalry a lot more, heavy cavalry a lot more, but they didn't change their system. So this heavy cavalry, right, you taxed people, you paid the heavy cavalry, you bought their equipment, you trained them, you paid them. It was all very bureaucratic, right? Most states from about 600 BC to about 1500 later, 1800 AD, if they wanted heavy cavalry, most states, what they did is they got the cavalry guy to extract the income of the local peasants himself, to pay for his own equipment, to pay for his own training, and then he would provide his services for his lord. Notice that's massively economizing on the administrative structure, but that doesn't take much bureaucracy. It takes very little bureaucracy. You're getting the guy to do it himself. That's how the Parthians did it. That's how the Sassanids did it. And the Romans are trying to do it for this expensive bureaucratic structure, and it doesn't work. So you've got to think of those terms. And the migrations into the empire were deadly, because you had this expensive bureaucracy which was inefficient compared to the alternative, which is a Germanic warrior takes a estate, provides his services. No bureaucracy required. And you get local people who this increasingly expensive and decreasingly effective bureaucracy is effectively oppressing. And you get these new Germanic warlord turns up and says, I've got a deal for you. And by the way, I've got all the armed blokes anyway. So, right. And so you get that local interest being married to some Germanic warlord, and everyone deciding they can do without the imperial bureaucracy, which clearly for the next how many centuries they did. Right. So you've got to think of those terms. Now, the other thing they get wrong is their understanding of how the West got rich and the problems of contemporary Western society. Now, they're obsessed with analogies that they don't pick the analogies that are there, and they're obsessed with the analogies that aren't there. So one of the analogies that isn't there is they have this really silly passage or section where they try and compare the fall of Roman Britain to Brexit, which is just ridiculous, right? What happened in Roman Britain is you've got this overstressed, increasingly inefficient, increasingly not fit for purpose bureaucracy that doesn't have the revenue to protect Britain, so it abandons Britain. But the British society, it doesn't have local organisational structures that are worth anything. It doesn't have military troops that are worth anything much. It's just abandoned. And they try and sort of cobble together something locally, which mostly doesn't work. And, whoever Arthur was based on was a sort of reflowering that fell over. And, the Welsh were the only bit left by the time the Anglo-Saxons had turned up. To compare that with a completely coherent British polity deciding that it wasn't going to be in the EU anymore is just ridiculous. They have nothing in common except they're not part of the system anymore. Right? If you want to look at Brexit, the first Brexit isn't Roman Britain being abandoned by the imperial authorities. The first Brexit is Henry VIII deciding he's not going to be part of the capitalist system anymore, right? And I remember Rob Starkey saying very darkly that a whole lot of Heraclean acts had to be repealed so Britain could join the EU. So that's a stupid analogy. The idea, which they actually say at one point, that Europe got rich by the transfer of wealth from less developed areas is just not true. Now, it's perhaps a little bit more obviously true if you're Australian, because Australia has always been a farm and a quarry. We're still a farm and a quarry. There's other things we do, but basically when it comes to our exports, we're a farm and a quarry. We've always been a farm and a quarry. We're richer than the British. Why are we richer than the British? Because our institutions work better. Why did Singapore become rich? Because they built institutions. Lee Kuan Yew looked at England and said, I like the way the English do things. We're going to do a Chinese version of that in Singapore. And it worked. Just like a Chinese version of that in Hong Kong worked. And just like a rather more Chinese version of copying the West worked in Taiwan. Right. And, Suzuki Kama doing the same sort of copying exercise, but adapting it to local conditions, which is really important, worked in Botswana. It helped that he was effectively the hereditary monarch of the largest tribe. It, was certainly helpful. Botswana, there's the main tribe, which is about 80% of the population. There's all these tiny tribes. So the main tribe doesn't feel itself bothered, it doesn't feel threatened. It's confident that, it's 80% under a completely democratic system. All right. Okay. Kenya's functional for much the same way. The Kikuyu are such a huge proportion of Kenya, they don't feel threatened, right? So they can even have a non-Kikuyu president, and it's fine. So that makes a difference. But nevertheless, if you can adapt the European institutions to your own system, you can get rich by Europe like Europeans. It's the institutional structure that counts. I mean, a comparison I'm always making, Portugal was it and Spain were the first off the mark within maritime empires. It had a maritime empire compared to itself, which was very large for a long time. It's the last one to lose it, or just give up its maritime empire, which it didn't do until the 70s. It's the poorest country in Western Europe. Conversely, Switzerland, right, landlocked, absolutely never had an empire. But leaving aside sort of weird little cases like Monaco and Luxembourg, is the richest country in Western Europe, right? This gets back to why capitalism is a bad terminology. Because empires are what states do. And the idea that an empire is a benefit to your local economy is false. And you can really, really see this with the Iberian empires, right? Because, yes, the bullion flows from the Americas was a huge boon to the Spanish and the Portuguese crowns, particularly the Spanish crown, which basically lived off as American silver. This was bad for the Spanish economy and bad for the Spanish society. Why was it bad? Two reasons. It meant the Spanish crown didn't much have to negotiate with anybody and didn't much have to, none of the locals, and didn't much have to pay any attention to the needs of local commerce because it wasn't all that important to its revenue base. And you had all this silver flooding into Spain, and silver is the main monetary metal, which means Spanish manufacturers were expensive. They were silver dear because that's where the silver hit Europe first. So it undermined their ability to export, and you had a state that didn't really care much about local commerce because, well, silver comes from America. We just dig it up. We're rich. It's fine. So you can see that the empire was great for the Spanish crown, but it was not good for Spanish society, and it was certainly not good for the Spanish economy. And you go to Britain. Okay, you look at Britain. By 1913, they're running about a quarter of the planet. It's very impressive. And then you look at, okay, how much money did Britain actually make from its empire? And you look and you discover it's about 5% of GDP, which is not a lot for running a quarter of the planet. What that meant, of course, was over 90% of the British economy had nothing to do with the empire. And when you look at these vast European empires, were they conquered by main armies? No, they were conquered by small expeditionary forces. Why? Because the way that European civilization had developed and the intense competition between the European states meant that they had really, really, really capable states and really, really capable institutions, so they could literally conquer a place with small expeditionary forces. Like, Cortez takes over Mexico with a few hundred men. Now, why did he do that? Well, two reasons. One is disease. You export the entire Eurasian disease package to the Americas, and people die in horrifying numbers. And the other reason is the Aztecs were trying to run an urban civilization with no domesticated herbivores. And what do you do when you do that? You sacrifice people and eat them. That's what you do, because you don't have any other good meat source, really. And of course, that meant that there were locals who hated them because they would go to war with them, capture their people, and eat them. So if you're the Spanish, you turn up and say, yeah, you hate these guys. Let's join them. Let's join, And Cortez had an army that was much bigger than a few hundred Spaniards because there were always locals who went, yeah, we want to kill them. And sort of log rolling. And the same thing happened in the Inca Empire. Pizarro never had very many troops, but he said to the locals, look, join Christianity and our rule is one man, one wife. And there's all these local men who couldn't get married because the Inca controlled the women, basically. And they basically said, you mean for you or Johnny, you get to get married? And Pizarro said, yes. And they go, Christian, where do we sign up? Okay, so they in fact, this is a habit. The Spanish Empire did the same in the Philippines. They basically rolled around the archipelago, getting everybody to agree not to be pirates against each other. So you get these vast areas that conquered by remarkably small expeditionary forces because they were brave. Whatever else about them, they were brave. They had much better military technology. And they had all this experience about how do you manipulate the locals to get them to do what you want because the locals hate each other. Or else, in the case of the Philippines, if somebody could just come in, they could all agree not to pirate each other, right? Which is, it was an archipelago, people pirated each other all the time. The Spanish log rolled around saying, let's all agree not to pirate each other and we'll protect you against pirates. And basically everyone said, yes, let's do that. So it's the organizational capacity and the intense competition, right? So Francis Bacon points out in about 1604 that the compass, gunpowder, and the printing press were transforming the world. They were in European hands. They were all invented by the Chinese first. What did they do in China? Not a lot, really. They didn't even transfer China all that much. You put them in European hands where you've got a different institutional structure, a different highly competitive state structure. They're all desperately competing against each other because they're all fighting each other all the time. You end up with really effective states who are really good at generating wealth and tax revenue, and so are very effective. Rich states mainly trade with each other. The overwhelming majority of rich states trade with each other. Say, 1913, a quarter of the planet, 5% of British GDP, but they've got to pay to administer a quarter of the planet. And they've got to pay for a Royal Navy, which has to be big enough to beat any two other navies and basically control the entire planet. That's expensive. That's really expensive. So by the time you're paid for all that, the empire is optimistically awash. So when Britain, for whatever reason, partly gives up, partly gets pushed out of its empire, does Britain become poorer? No. Britain becomes richer. All the imperial metropoles become richer. Why? because getting access to the American market and getting access to the maritime order the Americans imposed through their alliance system and their US Navy is much more valuable and a lot cheaper than running an empire. So if you're Japan, you get your empire stripped from you, you get bombed flat, but you have the culture and the institutions that work, you can rebuild yourself, and it turns out being part of the American maritime order, much more valuable than having your old empire. And everyone found that. And of course, the big problem China has at the moment is of all the states that benefit from the American maritime order in the present time, the state that benefits the most is China, because it imports inputs for its food, it imports energy, it exports massively, all on the back of a pacified set of oceans based on the American maritime hegemony. Right. So there's this enormous contradiction in Chinese policy, where on one hand they clearly resent the American dominance, but on the other hand, they're massive beneficiaries from it. This is a bit of a segue, but it goes back to what actually makes you rich. What makes you rich is trading with rich people and having the institutions to produce the stuff and to add to your productive capacity. It's not living off the resources of the rest of the world.
I think, Lorenzo, the big takeaway here is, number one, people can either read John Rapley and Peter Heather's book. Two, they could read Edward Gibbon's Fall of the Roman Empire. Or three, I think they could listen to this if they want to bypass all of that and get a good analysis of really what's gone on without having to either read a very short book that goes on tangents and modern, or Gibbon's many volumes.
Beautifully written.
Beautifully
many volumes.
Yes, a beautifully written many volumes. For the YouTube culture, this will suffice. I will include the links in the show notes for all of the articles that we've talked about today, Lorenzo. I suggest anyone who has access to Substack should go and subscribe to Lorenzo. It's currently free, but you should pay him for what he does. It is very, very good, and he leaves receipts, lots of references. Lorenzo, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on again, and look forward to the next time.
Thank you. It was been great. Thank you very much, John.
To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.